Good morning, Jonathan and Jillian. This is your first video for American History 2. So I'll be lecturing about 15 minutes in each video. That seems to be the optimal for upload to YouTube. And you'll probably have 5 or 6 of these to watch a week and then some internet research to do and send me the results in an email, okay? So it's not the same as having face-to-face conversations across the desk, but we'll do as much of that as we can via other means. All right, so the first lecture on video, we're going to need to look at identity politics. It really was born in the 1960s and kind of hit its stride in the 1970s. So we were talking about the Nixon administration, Watergate, and his fall, but that was 75. But let's go back 10 years to the mid-1960s to talk about the civil rights movement. We've done this before, but I want to lay the groundwork. You'll remember the Civil Rights Act of 1964, passed in the immediate aftermath of the assassination of John Kennedy. He died on the 22nd of November 1963. Lyndon Johnson, his vice president, became president. And Johnson used the nation's veneration for the dead president's memory to get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed, something Kennedy had not been able to pass in his actual presidency, his actual lifetime. But just enough Republicans and non-Southern Democrats got together behind the bill that they were able to get it passed. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 essentially outlawed discrimination on the basis of race in all forms of public accommodation. That's the crucial idea there. Public accommodation, anything that held itself out to the public as being open for business, pretty much falls under its purview, and you can't discriminate on the basis of race. It has since been amended many times to go beyond race to ethnic origin, religious origin, and sex. So it's very difficult today under the Civil Rights Act as amended to discriminate on the basis of any of those classes. But notice this idea that people fall into certain classes, categories whose rights are protected. The recognition that sometimes people are discriminated against because of the type of person they are. And let's face it, racists know nothing about the individual African American. They just assume that all blacks are this way, or they're people who may discriminate against women or other ethnic minorities because of the class of person they are, not anything about them as individuals. And the Civil Rights Act largely outlaws that kind of discrimination in public accommodation. If you hold yourself out as welcoming the public to your business, don't discriminate on the basis of any of those things. Now, for a long time, and maybe in certain isolated cases that may still exist, you could and can discriminate if you're an entirely private organization. So there are perhaps, I don't know that there are very many, but there might still be a few men's-only country clubs. There was for a long time a feeling that, if we let ladies on the golf course, it'll ruin things. But for these men who wanted, I guess, to get away from their wives or something, I don't know why. But for decades, many country clubs, golf courses were male-only, and I think the last of those major bastions fell within the last 10 years. But they could discriminate on the basis of sex because of the fact that they were private clubs. Private clubs can still get away with discrimination in most cases if they wish, although the social pressure for that's become pretty, to avoid that has become pretty strong. So you don't find very many of those. Anyway, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as amended over the next 30 years, really did foreground this idea of discrimination against a class, government action to protect classes of people. And it reflects a turn to what's been called identity politics. Identity politics. The first identity group to receive legal protection under this Civil Rights Act of 1964 was, of course, African Americans. So we should start by talking about the groups that fostered this identity, and one of those, of course, is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. That group, Martin Luther King Jr. and other giants of the first generation of the modern civil rights leadership, were mostly pastors, Christian pastors, who were members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Add that to the much older, century older National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. And this is kind of the classic old guard of black civil rights leadership. But there were young people in the early 60s who wanted very much to get involved, and they tended to be pushing for faster change, more comprehensive change. So you had the, let's see, oh heck, I'm drawing a blank on the name. SNCC, there you go, SNCC. SNCC is what it's called, SNCC. The Student National Coordinating Committee was a civil rights organization. As you can probably guess by the name, it was college students, black college students originally, but it reflected this younger generation more pushing forward with more aggressive change. And so with the old guard and the new groups like SNCC, pushing the Civil Rights Act and civil rights in general, really did push forward for African Americans much more aggressively, much better in the 1960s. And yet there were still people in the African American community who felt things were not going fast enough, and that African Americans were still in physical danger. And then, the Klan and other racist organizations were physically attacking blacks. And among the groups that formed out of this sort of frustration at the pace of change and this fear of white backlash turning violent, you have the rise of shall we say, well, it was called Black Power, but in some ways it was an African separatist movement that whites will never give blacks the fair shake they deserve, treat them properly. So there began to be some radical black activists who said blacks should separate themselves from white society to the greatest extent possible and look after their own interest inside their own community. It was, back in the 1920s, you had people like Marcus Garvey espousing this idea, but it comes back again in the 1960s, often associated with the term Black Power. And Stokely Carmichael would be an example of that. The group that probably many Americans, older Americans, would think of in terms of this would be the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party. Although they were called a party, they were really a militant organization. They armed themselves. They threatened police officers with violence if they felt African Americans in their community were being abused by the police. And they did get involved in some serious acts of violence against police officers. But they did push the agenda of this Black Power movement as far as they could, and many of them wound up in prison for activities connected to the Black Panther Party. I think there were some bank robberies to get money and things like that. It was, you could see things had pushed well beyond the Christian pastors of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. In just a decade, you saw a pretty significant radicalization. Another group that really came into public consciousness, white public consciousness at this time, was the Nation of Islam. Now, Islam, of course, is a world faith, 1.5 billion adherents in Mecca. We've studied all that before together in the past. But the Nation of Islam is not Orthodox Islam. It has elements, many mainstream Muslims would call them heretics. They have some fairly odd ideas. And built into their ideology is this assumption that white people are basically evil. It's not about a universal brotherhood. It definitely has a tinge to it that the white man is not going to treat the black man fairly. And notice, Nation of Islam is a black organization. It is. I don't know that they even allow non-black members. So again, this Islam itself, real Islam, 1.5 billion people Islam, every color and every nationality is part of that. There are Europeans who are Muslim, but not the Nation of Islam. It's a black movement. A figure who really came to the fore in the 1960s called himself Malcolm X. The X there was because he refused to use a slave name. The name he'd been born with, he felt was grossly inappropriate because it was whoever had enslaved his distant ancestors. He got stuck with that name. So he called himself Malcolm X. And Malcolm X, again, he was a Nation of Islam leader, very charismatic, attracted a lot of African Americans to that movement with his public speaking. But he also took a fairly aggressive point when there was violence against blacks. He would talk about defending black America, quote, by any means necessary, unquote. And that by any means necessary, most people took to mean violence. So that was where he was. However, he had a kind of spiritual awakening, and he left the Nation of Islam to convert to mainstream, normal Islam, which does teach universal brotherhood, at least part of its teachings. And he went on a pilgrimage to Mecca, and he saw people of all different races who were Muslims, and realized the racist part of the Nation of Islam thought was not Muslim. And he left the Nation of Islam, began talking about peaceful coexistence with the whites, if possible, and he was murdered. Now, the initial investigation, he was said he was killed by Nation of Islam fanatics. Though I do believe the state of New York, where he died, has recently reopened the case to look at it again, see if it really was the Nation of Islam that killed Malcolm X. But Malcolm X was a more radical civil rights leader, you might say, than Martin Luther King Jr. So now there are streets named after American cities, but for many white Americans, he was going the wrong direction in the 60s, but he has become something of a hero to many African Americans in recent decades. So the first of these identity politics groups, the groupings were around African American issues of civil rights. And when they succeeded by organizing and gaining the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the protections it afforded African Americans, other ethnic groups started looking at the possibility that they might too organize and protect their own interests. Mexican American farm laborers in California were being exploited, they felt, by the grape-growing farmers, the owners of grape vineyards. Required physical labor to pluck these grapes off the vines, put them in the baskets, haul them in, and that they were being paid far too little for this very difficult physical labor. And they felt it was largely because they were Mexican Americans or Mexican immigrants, and that they're being discriminated against on the basis of ethnicity. And a man named Cesar Chavez organized these California grape pickers into a union. National Farm Workers Association. The National Farm Workers Association, organized in 1965, and he took them out on a boycott, on a strike, basically, to not pick the grapes. The grapes were ready for harvest; they were ripe on the vines, and the people who were going to pick them said, "We're not going to pick them till you pay us better, treat us better, give us better housing to stay in when we're working on your vineyards and so on." The vineyard owners tried at first to wait them out. Said, "Oh, you folks are poor. You can't wait without income." But Chavez, kept them united, and they eventually did get the growers to give in to the demand. And this was really the first time that a national attention been drawn to Mexican American, Latino concerns as a group. It really was a watershed moment. LULAC, the League of United American Citizens, would grow out of this. The idea that the Mexican Americans or other people of Latin American heritage should band together to protect their rights in the same way African Americans had. was new with Cesar Chavez in the mid-1960s. By the late 60s, another group that had clearly been discriminated against in American history, abused in many ways, and often, Native Americans began to organize the American Indian Movement. AIM, A-I-M, American Indian Movement, was a pressure group formed to protect the rights of Native Americans. The plight of the reservation was and is a terrible business. Poverty on Indian reservations still a very major problem. Alcoholism, drug abuse, no economic opportunity. Native American reservations are virtually always far from cities, and there's just not much economically going on most Native American reservations. The casinos you might associate with them now, that really started in the 80s, I think, and sort of hit its stride in the 90s. But so a lot of Indian reservations, because they are technically nations, they're not fully under the authority of the states of the Union. They can pass their own laws when you're on the reservation, so they can gamble on the Indian reservations where you can't in the rest of that state, like Oklahoma. All the casinos in Oklahoma are on Indian reservations, I think, because of that sort of quirk in our Constitution that Native Americans are separate nations. In a sense, Indian law is extremely complicated. They're American citizens. They are subject to the laws of the states in which they live, but they're also citizens of Indian nations, and the nations have rights, and as citizens of those nations, they have special rights. But when I say special rights, don't get the impression that they get some hugely special treatment. In fact, Native Americans, as AIM pointed out, were often very disadvantaged in American society. And in the early 70s, they began massive protests and so on to call attention to their plight. We'll be back in lecture 2 to talk about women's rights. Bye.